They used to say that food, I mean, I remember in med school, food cannot be an addiction because it's a natural element. And right now, food is not so natural anymore. There's so many things that make you addicted to it. But so the mechanism of food addiction is coming from all the chemicals, or is it something that, how do you define food addiction today? Or just an emotion?
Well, up until about 15 years ago, I wasn't so convinced of the notion of food addiction, but I have come around to it. I think you're right that, the foods that are sort of inducing addictions are modern foods that are highly processed, and they're very often sweet and they're very often fatty. Some of them are sweet and fatty together, or they may be fatty and salty together, French fries and things. These are delicious, palatable foods that have been designed to be very, very, very palatable. And they are very palatable, and they're very caloric also. Now, most of us can enjoy those foods, and we want them when we're hungry, perhaps. But we don't become addicted. We're not food addicts in that sense. But just like cocaine, most people who take cocaine do not become compulsively addicted to cocaine. Even people who take it in very severe ways, like intravenous cocaine, if you come back and say how, after of all those who have tried that, you find about a third of them don't take it ever again. They didn't really like that intravenous cocaine. Another third of them go on and keep on taking cocaine, but they can give it up. They're not compulsively addicted. But about a third of them do become compulsive. Alcohol is addictive, but most people who drink alcohol don't become compulsively addicted. Some do. So it's always a percentage of people who are vulnerable. Now, I think the same is true for food addiction. Most of us can resist these palatable modern foods. Some of us eat more of it than others, but most of us are not addicted to food. But there are some people, and this really comes from the neuroimaging studies of it, who show, when you put them into the scanner, they show the kind of hyperreactivity to these food cues, of palatable cues, that drug addicts would show to drug cues. It's that similar sort of thing. It is possible to sensitize mesolimbic systems without drugs. It is possible to do that even in animals. Terry Robinson, my colleague here, has shown that in the 1990s. And it may be that some of us are so vulnerable to sensitization that we can develop it for foods. Or for gambling. There's evidence for gambling. Compulsive gambling has the same. Some people have this hyperlimbic signature, or some other behavioral addictions. The evidence is moving in that direction. So I have been converted to thinking at least some people can have a food addiction. Some people can have a legitimate gambling addiction.
So I remember they used to talk about the 4 C's: craving, compulsion, consequence, no negative consequence, and control, self-control. So this can be applied to food, craving, compulsion, don't care about the consequence. What about the internet? They talk today about internet addiction. Is that in the same category for you?
I think it's plausible that it will be. There have been a few fMRI studies of sort of internet addiction, and it's going along in this vein. It's much less evidence so far than, say, the compulsive food addiction, compulsive gambling, or even compulsive sex addiction literature. That's been done quite a lot of fMRI studies so far. The internet addiction, social media addiction is sort of a newer thing. And the evidence, if we want fMRI evidence to say, yes, we've got some people who with this hyperlimbic hyperreactivity, it's hard to point to a big pile of evidence yet. But my guess is it's going to come along. It's very, very plausible that it will be similar. If gambling can do it, there's reason to think that the internet and social media could do it, at least for some individuals. The real question, and for which we have no idea of what the answer is going to be, is what percentage of people who are using these social media things or gambling, everybody eats, but what percentage of people are actually developing it in a compulsive way, these behavioral addictions with a sensitized-like signature? A few do. And they're the ones who have been popped into these studies, and they're popped into these studies because they are so severe. They've come to psychiatrists and they've been treated, and it's so severe, so they get chosen for these studies. Nobody has really kind of done a demographic study where you take a lot of people with it and sort of say how many of them have this. We do not know the answer to that. So my guess is going to be for the behavioral addictions, sometimes it's a legitimate word. Sometimes it's just a word to mean I do it a lot and I really want to do it. But it may be that I still can control it. It isn't compulsive in that sense. It's like a strong urge that lots of us have for various things, but we can control it. The difference between that and the true addiction is only going to be a matter of degree. It's not a qualitative difference. It's a matter of degree, but it has kind of qualitative consequences for a person's life. So it would be important to know.
And we talk about mesolimbic in green in that terrain. We also have the mesocortical involved in addiction.
And that's a legitimate distinction, the cortical dopamine versus the limbic. However, I should say that orange line, actually parts of that should be green, because parts of the cortical projection are going to limbic cortex, very emotional reward motivation targeted cortex. Like at the very front, there's something called the orbital frontal cortex just over our eyes, which is limbic cortex. Or where the word dorsal striatum is, it's pointing down below, but that where the words dorsal striatum actually are, where the letters are, that's the anterior cingulate cortex, and there is that's partly a limbic cortex too. So some of these parts of the cortex are getting dopamine, and they're participating in reward motivation, just like the nucleus accumbens. So to say, those aside, other parts of the frontal cortex are truly different. And they're getting the dopamine, they're the mesocortical system. They're using dopamine for things like attention, paying attention to this, paying attention to that, or they're using related norepinephrine neurotransmitter for that. And they're not really part of this addiction syndrome or reward motivation syndrome. It's using that dopamine molecule again, signaling a very different function in those parts of the cortex. So it's different.
It's interesting.
Yes.
What about pain? Pain, and I remember the Parkinson people begin to sensitive to pain because they don't have their dopamine. So, and there's many centers for pain, we talk about the periaqueductal gray matter and thalamus and, places like that. So there's functional dopamine pain?
Well, that's a fair question. And the answer is going to be subtle, I think, but the answer is yes, it's leaning in that direction. We used to think that really pain control was really all about the opioid system, which is massively involved in pain control and most analgesia, as you said, periaqueductal gray. Opioids suppress pain in those systems. But there's evidence that pain and analgesia is also processed in things like the nucleus accumbens that's getting the dopamine inputs. It is possible to activate the nucleus accumbens with placebo analgesia, for example, that reduces pain. And there's reason to think that if we manipulate the nucleus accumbens, we can modulate pain perception. So dopamine being released in the nucleus accumbens may modulate pain perception. And some dopamine-releasing drugs are being used for treating pain in sort of chronic pain conditions with some success. I would say we don't fully understand how it's working. I mean, we can say, yes, we know something's happening here in the nucleus accumbens and related structures, but exactly what that's doing there and how it's relieving the pain, we don't understand. It's just beginnings of that.
So we have many places when we can stop the pain signal from the spinal cord, from the receptors, the nociceptors. Then you have nucleus accumbens, periaqueducal gray matter, thalamus, some part of the basal ganglia, the anterior cingulate cortex. So all those are probably going to stop different part of the signal, and they're going from top down, from the bottom up. So it's a very complex system then to understand. And the dopamine just one spot or one part of it.
Dopamine would be a small part. I mean, the opioid is a massive part, and even that has several levels. Like, as you say, dopamine or opioids in the spinal cord can, to some degree, stop the pain signals from coming in. So that's acting as a gate there. But the most massive effects of opioids at producing analgesia and pain relief are in structures, like you said, the periaqueductal gray. And what they're doing is not blocking the pain from coming up. They're actually activating, as you said, the top-down system that reaches back down into the spinal cord and sort of squashes the pain actively. That was discovered in the 1990s, and it was a sort of a jaw-dropping discovery that the brain had this anti-pain system, but that's the major way by opioids work. Then there's several other little ways going further up that you pointed to. And where dopamine fits into this is, it's as a small bit player, but it is as a player.
So I was thinking dopamine for wanting and, excess wanting. So how do we control? What is controlling dopamine? How appetite control? How is, addiction control? What should balance and over dopamine secretion in the brain?
Well, it's a great question, and we wish we had a magic bullet cure for addictions and other disorders. I mean, appetite, hunger and satiety appetite actually brings up a whole new role for dopamine in the brain, because there is dopamine in the hypothalamus. I think you were going to show the hypothalamus.
Right.
And it acts there in a totally different way from in the striatum or nucleus accumbens.
So in the hypothalamus, I know there's the periventricular in green and the arcuate in purple. Maybe there's more?
Yes, especially those areas you pointed to, the periventricular, in green. Right there is where dopamine or norepinephrine or serotonin, if you just squirt a little microinjection of dopamine or these other things there, it suppresses appetite quite dramatically. You know, the first dieting drug in the 1960s was amphetamine. People would take amphetamine, stimulating dopamine release, and they would lose weight. It was very effective. They would become addicted, a lot of them, but they would lose weight. And most of the modern dieting drugs, up until the new recent GLP-1 agonists, have been sort of mild versions, very mild amphetamines that release norepinephrine or dopamine in that PVN, or serotonin agonists that also release serotonin in that PVN. And all of them in that structure tend to suppress appetite. So there it's very different from dopamine and the nucleus accumbens that could increase appetite and desire. It's specifically reducing appetite.
There's peri and para. So we're talking of the periventricular, not the paraventricular. But what I remember is the dorsal median nucleus and the ventral median. Those are the two satiety centers, right? Also.
Yes, that's right. You can kind of see they're all lined up on top of each other, connected together.
Yeah, yellow, dorsal medial, ventral medial, and peri. So those.
That's right, and they're all sort of along the midline of the hypothalamus, right? They're sort of in the middle part of the hypothalamus.
Midline
and
here.
That's where these dieting drugs are suppressing appetite. The various drugs have been various combinations of serotonin agonists and weak amphetamines, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in combination, fen-phen, for example, and they all were acting there. They all mildly suppress appetite. They also all have other side effects that sometimes made a lot of those drugs taken back off the market because they affect the heart and things, dopamine and serotonin in the heart. So that's a very different, that's like a third dopamine system, the cortical attention system, the mesolimbic reward system, and motor striatal system, and now this third hypothalamic appetite suppressing system.
So how many types of dopamine do we have? How many types of, you mentioned dopamine receptor, D2, D3.
Okay, well, it's all the same dopamine. It's that same dopamine molecule, and so that doesn't change.
One type.
One molecule, that's dopamine. A single enzyme can convert dopamine to norepinephrine or back and forth, so you can kind of go back and forth between them. And serotonin is also kind of related to them a little more distantly. The receptor is the lock that unlocks whatever it's going to do to that neuron.
So you have 5 receptors, or you have more now?
For dopamine, you have 5 receptors, but they fall into 2 camps. So D1 and D2 are the major family camps of receptors.
You know, I was thinking we have dopamine in the blood, and we have L-dopa and dopamine. Now, I remember the action of dopamine on the lymphocytes, on the immune system. So within the brain, even if there's a blood-brain barrier, we have lymphocytes that are stimulated by dopamine, usually to reduce the activity of the lymphocytes. So when we have this gambling addiction or any kind of addiction, we have a reduced activity of lymphocytes.
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, most of the addiction neuroscience is focused sort of on neurons and their interactions, neurotransmitters and receptors. But it is becoming clear that other things that are in the brain are also playing a role in neural signaling and psychological function, from glial cells to lymphocytes. And so it's conceivable that, yes, something like that is playing a role. I don't actually know of any studies that are giving direct evidence on it, so I can't say yes or no to the question, but I wouldn't rule it out as a possibility.
And when we do those D2, D3 receptor agonists, do we have any action on the kidneys, on the pancreas, on the guts? It absolutely doesn't cross the barrier and doesn't have any peripheral actions?
That's a good question too, and I don't know the answer to it. My guess would be that it is having effects because these are orally taken drugs, and so they're throughout the entire blood system. Anywhere there are D2, D3 receptors, these drugs would have the possibility of acting. So it is conceivable that they are affecting physiological functions beyond the brain. There probably is a bit of a literature on that. It's just not one that I'm in touch with.
Right. Well, it would be, it increase urine output. So we could ask if the patient pee more, reduce gastrointestinal motility and things like that. So
absolutely.
What is the future study that you're expecting for in the dopamine field? Any exciting things coming up for the future?
Well, there's going to be loads of things always in the dopamine field. And in my own field and lab, what we're really interested in is brain mechanisms that cause and control wanting for things in the brain, including dopamine. But dopamine is like a major linchpin in that system, but it's not the only thing. And also to kind of capture the addiction aspect, we have a lot of things that will control the intensity of desires, dopamine manipulations and others. But in addiction, an interesting thing is what controls the focus of a desire, the target of a desire. You know, when you're hungry, you want food. When you're thirsty, you want a drink of water or something, but you're not so food. At other moments, you want something else. So the target of our mesolimbic dopamine wanting system is changing from moment to moment. In addiction, something gets wanted above other things, and very, very fixedly.
That's one of my questions. I mean, those people have a lot of dopamine. Why don't they get addicted to everything? Food, sex, drug, absolutely everything. It's not exactly like that. They have a target.
That's right. It's a great question. And it shows that, yes, dopamine is not a rising tide that floats all boats. It can do that to some degree. So if you just take a dose, the whole world can brighten, and it's engaging, and people are interesting and attractive, and things are, yes, I want to do this thing. So all these things. But it becomes focused. The brain is looking for a target to pin this dopamine activation on, and it learns that target, and it then becomes narrowly fixed on that target. This happens in daily life as we learn the things we want, but it happens also in addiction. So we're using optogenetic brain manipulations now in animal studies to stimulate neurons in amygdala and such, and to sort of control the focus of wanting, to make it on this, but not that, and to make it intense and to make it narrow on this. And we can even create wanting for what hurts using these manipulations, kind of detaching wanting away from liking in a very strong way. Normally we want things that we like, but in addiction, we want things we start initially like, but some addicts may say, I don't actually like my drug so much anymore, but I still want it at certain moments, and I don't know why. I can't explain why. Well, the mesolimbic system can do that. We can create wants in the absence of any liking, and even wants in the presence of pain. We can create wanting for what hurts. How that's happening is something we're trying to understand. We're also trying to understand liking and mechanisms of pleasure, so that's another story.
So you can create a rat and decide for the rat that is going to be addicted to this, to that, or to this.
Yes. I could show you a short video if you would like in just the last couple minutes of our thing.
Yes. Yeah.
I wasn't planning to do it, so can you see this?
Yes, very well.
Okay, so let me go. So we're going to decouple wanting from liking. These are the rats we'll use. You can see they have little head caps. It doesn't hurt them. But you can see this little white thing is an optic fiber poking out. It's going down into its amygdala. And if we were to shine a laser light on this fiber, it will light up the amygdala. The amygdala has virus within it, a little microinjection droplet of a virus. So it sprouted photoreceptors, the neurons. And if the laser hits the photoreceptors on the neurons, it'll make the neurons fire when the laser is on. It's all doing it by recruiting this brain mesolimbic activation. And if we do a more addiction-like thing with, let's say, cocaine or sugar, if we give rats a choice between sugar pellets and cocaine, intravenous cocaine, because they have an intrajugular cannula, so it's painless cocaine to get the cocaine infusion. This rat can choose between getting a cocaine infusion by poking in this hole, or by earning a sugar pellet by poking in this hole. And if it pokes in the cocaine hole, the laser will come on, so it's like the shock rod. If it gets the sugar, it'll just get the sugar. So it's cocaine plus laser or sugar alone. But a different group of rats, they have the same choice, but the laser's opposite. So this group of rats, they can get cocaine, but it'll be cocaine by itself alone, or they can get sugar, but it'll be sugar with a laser. And the question is, what do rats do? This is what it's like in the situation, to see what it's like a rat actually doing it. The laser hole comes out and she can work, and she got that. She got the sucrose choice. If she pokes in the other hole, she'll get the cocaine. Let's see the results. The rats who had the laser put on sugar and not on cocaine, they become sugar addicts. They only work for sugar. They do not care about cocaine. There's nothing magic about intravenous cocaine as a reward. When you pit it against laser paired sugar, they just want the sugar. The other group of rats who had the laser on the cocaine, they become cocaine addicts. So this group became sugar addicts. This group becomes cocaine addicts. The cocaine addicts do not care about sugar. They only want the laser cocaine. Normal rats in this situation, they take a little sugar, they take a little cocaine, they take a little of both. Why not take a little of both? They're both nice things and they're both freely available. But you can make one into an addict if you put the laser on one or another. Then only one is valuable. It's intensely valuable, and the other reward is worthless by comparison. This is gaining control of the wanting system. It creates wants that are addictive and narrow in focus. It can create wants even for what hurts, like the shock rod. It's not creating pleasure liking. It's not making anything like, not the sugar, not the cocaine, not the shock rod. It's wanting. So it's an example of kind of gaining control of the system.
Now, in human, the central nucleus of the amygdala is an old part of the amygdala that has more to do with fear and things like this. We also have dopamine neurons in that part in human, or is specific to rat?
Yes, we do. So there are dopamine projections going right to the central nucleus of the amygdala. And the reason we're using the central nucleus, because as you say, it's kind of an ancient part, it's actually called a striatal part of the amygdala. It's different from cortical parts of the amygdala, like the basolateral part. I think you had Joe Ledoux as a conversationalist, and his fear circuit is the basolateral amygdala to the central nucleus amygdala. One is cortical, and the other is sort of striatal. An interesting thing about the striatal central nucleus amygdala is that it can generate very intense desires if you stimulate neurons within it. So if we spritz opioids on it, animals will pursue food rewards or sex rewards or drug rewards more. If we do the laser stimulation, we can kind of gain control of what it is they want and make them want these things.
Wow. Very interesting. I don't want to take all your time, Ken. I know you're really, really busy. It was so interesting. Stimulate my dopamine circuitry. I'm very motivated. Very interesting. And thank you so much for sharing those words. It was a great.
Well, it was fun to talk with you, Bruno. Thanks for the conversation.
Pleasure.